The door to my home office didn't open. It came apart. I don't mean they knocked and I didn't answer. I mean the frame splintered, the hinges gave way, and the whole thing swung inward at an angle. It was never designed to swing. The clock on my desk said 4:47 in the morning. I was in my recliner because my back had been bad all week, and the bed wasn't giving me any relief, so I'd come downstairs around 2, made myself a cup of chamomile, and fallen asleep with a James Lee Burke novel open across my chest. That's what I was doing when they came in. Hands. Let me see your hands right now. I was 63 years old, and I've been a civil engineer for 38 of those years. I'd never been in a police station for anything more than a noise complaint my neighbor filed in 1994 about a party my son threw while we were in Vermont. My hands went up before I even understood what I was seeing. 3 officers in tactical vests, one with a flashlight pointed directly at my face, one already moving toward the hallway. What is this? Who are you? Are there other people in the residence? My wife? She's upstairs. What is this? I heard her before I saw her. She must have woken up the moment the door went down, because she was already at the top of the stairs when the officer reached the landing, already calling my name, her voice that particular kind of high and sharp that I hadn't heard from her in 40 years of marriage. Not since the night our youngest had his accident on the highway outside of Roanoke. Don't come down, one of them said to her. Stay where you are, ma'am. She didn't stay where she was. She came down 4 steps, clutching the railing, wearing the blue robe her sister had sent her for Christmas, and she had her phone in her hand. I noticed that even then, even in the confusion of those first seconds, she already had her phone out, and she was already recording. I told myself she was calling 911. I told myself she was documenting what was happening to protect us both. I was wrong on both counts, but I didn't know that yet. There were a lot of things I didn't know yet. They put me in handcuffs in my own living room. I was wearing a white undershirt and flannel pajama pants, and the socks my daughter had sent me, the ones with little fishing lures on them, because I'd mentioned once that I wanted to take up fly fishing when I retired. My reading glasses were still on my face. One of the officers asked me to remove them, and I couldn't because my hands were behind my back. And there was a pause where he seemed to reconsider the situation, and then he reached over and took them off himself and set them on the side table next to the couch. That small thing, that one small, almost gentle thing. It was the strangest moment of the whole night, stranger even than what came later. What are the charges? I asked. Nobody answered me directly. One of them said something about a warrant, said something about financial crimes, and I heard the words, but they didn't connect anything real in my mind because they couldn't. They were describing someone else's life. This is a mistake, I said. Whatever this is, there's been a mistake. My wife was still on the stairs. She hadn't moved toward me. She hadn't said my name again after that first time. She was holding the phone steady, pointed at me, and her face. I've thought about her face 1,000 times since that morning. I've tried to find the word for what I saw there. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something much quieter and much worse than either of those things. They walked me out through the front door at 4:52 in the morning. The neighborhood was still dark, but the lights in 2 houses across the street were already on, and I could see a shape in Henderson's upstairs window, just a silhouette of someone standing there, watching. I don't know what I looked like to them. A man in his pajamas, reading glasses gone, hands behind his back, being guided down his own front steps by 2 officers, while a third waited by the cruiser. I imagine I looked small. I imagine I looked like exactly what they were making me look like. I did not look at my wife again before they put me in the car. The county detention center smelled like industrial cleaner and something underneath it that the cleaner couldn't touch. I was processed, photographed, asked a series of questions by a woman at a desk who had clearly asked these same questions 10,000 times before and had made peace with that. At some point, a different officer brought me a cup of water, and I drank it. And I sat in a room with pale green walls and a window that was more of a slot than a window. And I tried to make my brain work. Financial crimes. That was what they'd said. I was a retired civil engineer. I had a pension from the state of Virginia, a 401k I've been careful with for 30 years, and a savings account with enough in it to cover the roof replacement we've been putting off. My wife handled most of the household finances because she had always been better at it than me. She had a head for numbers in a way I never did, always knew exactly what was in every account, always balanced the checkbook to the penny. I trusted her with it completely. 40 years, I trusted her with all of it. I kept coming back to her face on the stairs. Around 7 in the morning, the detective came into the room and set a manila folder on the table between us. His name was on the lanyard around his neck, Aldridge. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, gray starting at the temples, the kind of tired that lives behind a person's eyes rather than in them. He sat down across from me and he looked at me for a moment without opening the folder, and I got the feeling he was reading something in my face the way you'd read a document, trying to decide if it was authentic. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I want to ask you some questions about Harborview Capital Management." I'd never heard of Harborview Capital Management. I told him that. He watched me say it. He didn't write anything down, just watched. "Your name appears on several account documents associated with our entity," he said, "along with an address in Fredericksburg that is listed as a business address." "I've never had a business address in Fredericksburg. I've never had any business address. I'm retired." "When did you retire?" 2 years ago. March of 2 years ago. I was with the Virginia Department of Transportation for the last 11 years of my career. He opened the folder then. Not all the way, just enough to look at something inside it without showing it to me. I watched his eyes move across whatever was on that page, back and forth, and then they stopped. He closed the folder. He sat back in his chair and looked at me differently than he had before. I don't know how else to describe it except that the quality of his attention changed, like a camera finding its focus. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I need to ask you a direct question and I need you to answer it honestly. Does your wife have access to your personal identification documents, your social security card, your passport, documents of that nature?" My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. Yes, I said. "We keep them in the same fire safe in the office. We've always kept them there." He nodded slowly. "Has your wife ever had reason to know your social security number? Your date of birth, your mother's maiden name?" "Of course she has. She's my wife." He picked up the folder again, and this time he stood up from the table. He walked to the door and opened it and spoke to someone outside in a voice too low for me to hear. Then he turned back to me, and he said something that I've replayed in my head almost every day since. He said, "I'm going to need you to wait here for a few minutes. There's someone I need to call before we go any further with this." And then he said, "I'm sorry for what you've been through this morning." Not "I'm sorry if there's been a mistake." Not "I apologize for the inconvenience." He said, "I'm sorry for what you've been through." And that difference, that small specific difference in the language, told me everything I needed to know about which direction this was going. I'd met my wife when we were both 22 years old. She was working the front desk at an engineering firm in Richmond where I had my first real job out of college. And she had dark hair and a directness about her that I'd never encountered in a woman before, and immediately couldn't stop thinking about. We were married 14 months later. We raised 3 children in 3 different houses as my career moved us around the mid-Atlantic, and we had buried her mother and my father, and we had sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours while our youngest had surgery on his spine after that car accident. And we had celebrated our 40th anniversary at a restaurant in Georgetown where the food cost more than my first car and neither of us cared even a little. I thought I knew her. Sitting in that pale green room with the slot for a window while Detective Aldrich made phone calls down the hall, I kept returning to that thought the way you return to a sore tooth with your tongue, pressing on it even though you know it's going to hurt. I thought I knew her. I had thought that about the same person for 4 decades. What I eventually pieced together, over the following days and weeks, through conversations with lawyers and investigators and ultimately through the evidence that came out when the case broke open, was this. 18 months before that morning, my wife had made contact with a man she knew from a financial planning course she'd taken at a community college years before we moved to our current home. I never knew she kept in touch with him. I had no reason to think she had. He had, by that point, built what can only be described as a sophisticated and patient fraud operation. He'd done it before. He targeted retired professionals, men and women, with stable incomes, clean credit histories, the kind of people who had spent their whole careers building something solid, and who, because of that, had never had reason to be suspicious. He needed identities. He needed the kind of person whose name on a document would look like exactly what it claimed to be. And my wife gave him mine. I don't know. I still don't know exactly when she made that decision. I don't know if it happened quickly or slowly. I don't know if she told herself it was temporary, or that the risk was minimal, or that I would never find out, or whether she thought about me at all in any of the moments that mattered. What the investigators ultimately concluded was that she had been an active participant, not a victim. She had provided not just my identifying documents, but information that only she could have provided: account numbers, personal security questions, details so specific that they could only have come from someone who had lived alongside me for 4 decades. She hadn't been manipulated. That was what they kept having to clarify when asked. She hadn't been coerced. She had been, as best anyone could determine, a willing partner in exchange for a portion of the proceeds. The amount, when they finally told me, was $340,000. I sat with that number for a very long time. Detective Aldrich came back into the room after 40 minutes with a woman from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Her name was Agent Pruitt, and she was all business, and I was grateful for it, because I didn't think I could handle sympathy at that moment. She laid out what they knew. She laid out what they were still working to verify. She told me that my name had appeared on documents associated with fraudulent investment accounts opened in 3 states: Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland, and that investors had lost a combined total of nearly $2 million. None of the money had gone to me. None of it had ever been in any account I controlled. The paper trail, once they started pulling it, was pointing somewhere else entirely. "We're going to need your cooperation," Agent Pruitt said. "You have it," I said, "whenever you need." She asked me a series of questions about my financial history, my accounts, my knowledge of the Harborview entity. I answered everything. I asked to call my son, who is an attorney, not a criminal attorney. He does real estate law in Baltimore. But he knew people and he could help me find the right representation before I said anything else. They allowed it. My son answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant someone had already called him. I didn't ask who. I told him where I was and what was happening, and I heard him go very quiet in the way he gets when he's thinking hard and fast. And then he said, "Dad, stop talking to them until I get there. Don't say another word to anyone." I told him I'd already answered their questions. He went quiet again. "All right," he said, "I'm coming. Don't eat anything they offer you, don't drink anything else, and if anyone comes in that room before I get there, tell them you're waiting for your attorney." I almost told him the coffee they brought me an hour ago had actually been decent. I didn't. My son arrived with a criminal defense attorney named Fowler, who had the manner of a man who had seen everything twice and was mildly annoyed to have to see it a third time. He reviewed the warrant and the charging documents and had a long conversation with Agent Pruitt outside the room while I sat with my son, who kept his hand on my arm and didn't say much. "Did you know?" he finally asked. Just that. Not how, not why, not what she was thinking. Just, "Did you know?" "No," I said. He nodded. He believed me. I'll never be able to fully explain how much that mattered. Fowler came back in and sat down and folded his hands on the table like a man about to deliver a verdict. "Here's where we are," he said. "The evidence they have points clearly away from you and toward your wife and the individual she was working with. They've been investigating this operation for 7 months. You are not the target of that investigation. Your identity was. There's a meaningful difference, and they understand that." He told me the charges against me would almost certainly be dropped within the week, once the financial forensics team completed their analysis. He told me I would need to remain available for questions, and I should not leave the state. He told me that my wife had been taken into custody that morning, not the same time as me, but later, after Aldridge made his phone calls, and that she was currently being processed at a different facility. I asked him if she had said anything. He said he didn't know yet. They let me go at 11:15 that morning. My son drove me home in his car, which meant I didn't have to figure out how to get back to a house I'd left in handcuffs at 5 in the morning. He sat with me for a while in the kitchen, and we made eggs, which felt like an insane thing to do and also exactly the right thing to do. He called his sister. He called his brother. I listened to him tell them the short version while I stood at the stove and tried to remember how I liked my eggs. Over easy. I'd liked them over easy my whole life. The charges were formally dropped 11 days later. The man my wife had been working with, I never used his name, I still don't, was arrested in a hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina, and subsequently charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The FBI eventually identified 6 other individuals whose identities had been used in similar operations. I was not the only retired professional whose name had appeared on fraudulent documents. I was, apparently, one of the cleaner targets, meaning my identity had been harder to contest because my credit history was so pristine. My wife was indicted on 4 counts. I didn't attend any of the hearings. My son went to keep track of what was happening legally, but I stayed home. I had 38 years of professional experience, and I'd handled complicated situations before: engineering projects that went sideways, government contracts that blew up, personnel issues that took months to untangle. I thought I understood difficult situations. I had never understood how difficult a situation could be until I had to decide what to do with every photograph in the house, every piece of furniture we'd picked out together, every object in every room that had a memory attached to it and was now attached to something else instead. I sold the house. I bought a smaller place on the other side of town, closer to my son and his family, and I put the old dining room table in storage because my granddaughter said she wanted it someday, and I believed her. I kept the dog, a 10-year-old beagle named Crawford, who had been her choice, and who didn't much care about anything that had happened as long as someone kept filling his bowl and taking him for his walk every morning along the creek path behind the new house. I kept taking him on that walk. I filed for divorce. My attorney handled most of it. The house proceeds were complicated by the ongoing criminal proceedings, but I had a good accountant and a meticulous filer, and eventually it was sorted. I recovered most of what could be recovered. Not all of it. You don't come out of something like this whole. What I want to say, and I've been trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like a lesson because I'm not interested in giving lessons. I'm just a 63-year-old man who had a very bad year. Is that the thing that saved me wasn't the evidence? It wasn't Fowler, though Fowler was excellent. It wasn't even my son showing up with the right person at the right time. It was Detective Aldrich saying, "I'm sorry for what you've been through this morning," because that told me, in the middle of the most disorienting experience of my adult life, that someone in that building had already looked at the situation clearly and had seen me. Not a suspect, not a name on a document, but a person. Something had happened to. That small piece of information gave me something to hold on to while everything else was moving. The truth is patient. That's what Fowler said to me on the day the charges were dropped. He said it the way you'd say it to a client, as a professional courtesy. One of those phrases attorneys have for difficult situations. But I've thought about it a lot since then, and I think he was right. And I think the reason the truth is patient is that it doesn't have any choice. It's not going anywhere. It just sits there and waits for everyone to catch up. Crawford is asleep at my feet right now. The creek path is still frozen in the mornings, but the ice is starting to thin, and by April it'll be clear all the way to the ridge, and I'll be 72 steps from good fishing if I ever get around to actually learning how. I don't know what I would do if the person I trusted most in the world had done this 10 years earlier, when the kids were still at home and the stakes were different. I think about that sometimes. I think about all the versions of this story that could have been worse. What would you do?